Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of World War II. It's raw, emotional, and pulls you right into the life of someone who lived through one of the most brutal fronts of the war, the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. Occasionally, a group of German airplanes would pass over our column with throbbing engines. We waved wildly at the pilots, who responded by dipping their wings. Higher up, squadrons of Ju-52s passed slowly over us, flying east. Our hot meals no longer warmed us, and frostbite was eating into my hands once again. Fortunately, this time our convoy included a doctor. Each time we stopped to eat, we lined up beside his truck. He coated my hands with a greasy, curative ointment, which I tried to keep on as long as possible as it reduced the pain in my cracked skin and preserved it from the cold. I kept my hands buried in the depths of my giant overcoat pockets, unless absolutely forced to pull them out, and then I was very careful not to rub off the ointment against the rough cloth. I spent long hours in the cab of a 3.5-ton Renault, jolting from rut to rut. From time to time, we had to remove the snow which accumulated between the mudguard and the tire, or help another machine which had skidded and gotten stuck. Otherwise, we avoided everything which obliged us to step outside. So far, I had escaped guard duty at night. When darkness made further advance impossible, we stopped where we were. The driver had the right to the seat. I usually slept on the floor with my legs wedged in beside the pedals and my nose on the engine, which gave off a sickening stench of hot oil. We always woke up stiff and numb with cold. Well before daybreak, we began the exhausting struggle of starting our frozen engines. Hals had come to see me several times, but my driver always protested that 3 was too many for our tiny cab. He advised me to go and see my friend instead, but that always came to the same thing, and there was certainly no question of standing outside for a chat. One day, just after we had passed a large town with a Luftwaffe airfield beside it, we were joined by a reconnaissance plane, which entered into radio communication with the Kommandiergruppe of the armored section accompanying us. A moment later, the plane left the convoy and veered to the north. The tanks in our column disappeared in whirlwinds of snow thrown up by their treads. We went on as before, without feeling any special anxiety. A few hours later, we heard the booming sound of distant explosions. This stopped, began again a few minutes later, then stopped, then began again. At 11 o'clock, the convoy halted in a village covered with snow. The sun was shining, and its gleam on the snow made us squint. The cold, although intense, was bearable. We walked over to the soup truck, whose 2 stoves were belching smoke. The first arrivals were sent by the cook to fetch the kettles. This cook was not at all a bad sort, and his skill was adequate at least to prevent insurrection. The dishes he prepared really weren't bad at all. The only oddity of his cooking style was that everything without exception was served with the same thick flour sauce. I joined Hals and Lenzen, and we were walking back to our trucks, bent over our steaming mess tins. Suddenly, a series of more or less distant explosions shook the icy air. We stopped for a moment and listened. Everyone else seemed to be doing the same thing. The explosions began again. Some of them were obviously far away. Instinctively, we began to hurry. "What's going on?" Lenzen asked an older soldier who was climbing into his truck. "Guns, fellows. We're getting closer," he said. We had all guessed this already, but we needed confirmation. "Ha," said Halls. "I'm going to get my gun." Personally, I didn't take any of this too seriously. There were a few more explosions, some separate and distinct, others overlapping each other. The departure whistle blew, and we climbed back into our trucks. The convoy jolted into motion. An hour later, as we reached the top of a hill, the gunfire brought us to a complete stop. It was coming from much closer. Each explosion literally shook the air, which was a very strange sensation. Some nervous drivers had stepped on their brakes much too quickly. Their trucks had skidded on the ice, and the drivers were racing the engines, trying unsuccessfully to straighten their machines. I had opened our door and was looking down the line of trucks. A Volkswagen was driving from the rear at top speed, and a lieutenant was shouting through its open door, "Hurry up! Get going! Keep moving! You! Help that idiot out of the rut!" I jumped down from our Renault and joined a group of soldiers trying to pull an Opel Blitz back onto the road. The firing had begun again. It seemed to be quite close and coming from the north. Slowly and with difficulty, the convoy began to move. As we had jammed on our brakes in the middle of an ascent, my driver had a particularly hard time starting up our truck. We descended slowly into a rolling wooded countryside. The dull sound of explosions continued. Suddenly, the trucks at the head of the column stopped again, and we heard the blast of a whistle. We quickly jumped to the ground. Soldiers were running to the head of the convoy. What was happening? The lieutenant of a while ago was running too, collecting a group of soldiers as he went by. I was one of them. Carrying our Mausers and running as fast as we could, we reached the front of the column. The big commander group a half-track seemed to have driven deliberately into the thick snow at the side of the road. "Partisans up ahead!" a sergeant shouted. "Scatter for defense!" He pointed to our left. Without understanding very much, I followed the sergeant, who was at the head of our group of 15 soldiers, and plunged into the snowy slope. As I pulled myself up on the white barrier, I could see very clearly a swarming mass of black figures emerging from a stunted woods and proceeding at right angles to our line of march. The Russians seemed to be moving as slowly as we were. The cold and the weight of our clothes combined to deprive this spectacle of the animation of westerns or of American so-called war films. The cold made everything sluggish, both gaiety and sadness, courage and fear. Ducking my head like everyone else, I moved forward, paying more attention to the position of my boots than to the movements of the enemy. The partisans were still too far away for me to see them in any detail. I imagined that, like us, they must be making huge strides to avoid disappearing in a hole in the snow. "Dig your foxholes," the sergeant ordered, lowering his voice as if the other side could hear us. I didn't have a shovel, but scraped away some snow with the butt of my rifle. Once I was crouched in this relative shelter, I was able to observe the scene at leisure. I was astounded by the number of men coming out of the woods opposite. There were so many of them, and I could see still others in the forest itself, through the branches of the leafless trees. They looked like ants swarming through tall grass. They were obviously moving from north to south. As we were moving east to west, I couldn't grasp their intention. Perhaps they were going to try to encircle us. Our troops had just set up a heavy machine gun battery on the slope nearest us, about 20 yards away. I didn't understand why there had not yet been any exchange of fire. The enemy had begun to cross the road, about 200 yards from us. The sound of big guns from the north was louder than ever, and there seemed to be some answering fire directly opposite us. My hands and feet were beginning to feel the cold. I didn't understand our situation and felt entirely calm. The band of Russians crossed the road without bothering us. They appeared to outnumber us by 3 or 4 to 1. Our convoy consisted of 100 trucks with 100 armed drivers and 60 accompanying troops whose sole function was defense. In addition, there were 10 officers and sergeants, a doctor, and 2 medical orderlies. Each explosion created clouds of powdered snow. From the wooded hill in the near distance, plumes of smoke synchronized with the increasingly frequent sounds of explosion rose into the air. The heavy machine gun to my right burst into sound for a moment and then fell silent. Stupidly, instead of crouching down in my hole, I lifted my head. I could see little white clouds puffing out among the numerous silhouettes of the partisans. There was a sound of dry detonation, with an answer in kind from the Russians. My eardrums had begun to feel as though they would burst from the noise of the machine gun, which was joined by another on the slope opposite. Everywhere, soldiers were firing their Mausers. Over in the Russian sector, the black silhouettes were running in all directions, faster and faster, through the puffs of white smoke. Some of them fell and lay motionless. The sun went on shining. None of it seemed really serious. Here and there, Russian bullets whistled through the air. The noise was deafening. With my slow reflexes, I hadn't yet fired. To my right, someone cried out. The sound of firing was almost continuous. The Bolsheviks were running as fast as they could toward the shelter of the snowy thickets. Our tanks were rolling toward them with sharp bursts of gunfire. 3 or 4 Russian bullets landed in the snow in front of me, and I began to fire blindly, like everyone else. 7 or 8 other tanks had arrived and were harassing the partisans. The whole episode lasted about 20 minutes, and when it was over, I had fired about a dozen cartridges. A short time later, our tanks and armored cars returned. 3 of them were driving prisoners ahead of them, in groups of about 15 men who all looked deeply humiliated. 3 German soldiers, supported by their comrades, climbed down from one of the cars. One of them seemed almost unconscious, and the other 2 were grimacing with pain. 3 wounded Russians and 2 Germans were lying inert on the back of one of the tanks, one of them moaning. A short distance off, a German soldier, leaning against a snowbank, was gesturing to us and holding his head, which was red with blood. "The road is clear," announced the commanding officer of the Mark IV nearest us. "You can go ahead." We helped carry the wounded to the hospital truck. I went back to my Renault. Lenson passed by close to me and shook his head in perplexity. "Did you see that?" he asked. "Yes. Do you know if anyone was killed?" "Of course." The convoy started off again. The idea of death troubled me, and suddenly I felt afraid. The sunshine of a moment ago had been pale, and the cold had become more intense. Bodies in long brown coats were lying along the sides of the road. One of them gestured as we passed. "Hey," I nudged my driver, "there's a wounded man waving at us." "Poor fellow. Let's hope his side takes care of him. War is hard that way. Tomorrow it may be our turn." "Yes, but we've got a doctor. He could do something for him." "You can talk. We've got 2 truckloads of wounded already, and the doctor has more than enough to keep him busy. You mustn't be upset by all this, you know. You'll see plenty more of it." "I already have." "I have too," he said without believing me. "Especially I've seen my own knee. The whole kneecap was taken out by a shell in Poland. I thought they were going to send me home again, but they stuck me into the driver's corps instead, along with the old men, the boys, and the infirm. It's no joke, you know. A wound like that really hurts, especially if you have to wait for hours before they give you any morphine." He launched into the history of the Polish campaign as he had experienced it. At that time, he had belonged to the 6th Army, which now was fighting in Stalingrad. It was growing dark. Our long convoy stopped in a small hamlet. The armored column was there too. The captain had ordered this halt so that the wounded could be cared for. The crust of snow and the roughness of the road made the hospital truck rock and jolt. The surgeon couldn't operate under such conditions. 2 Russians had already died of hemorrhage, and the rest of the men had already been waiting for several hours. Our truck had just stopped beside a large building where the peasants stored the harvest. I was about to open the door and run to the kitchen truck when my driver held me back. "Don't be in such a hurry, unless you want to be on guard duty tonight. The sergeant doesn't keep records here, you know, the way he does at the barracks. He just grabs the first people he sees, assigns them, and then takes it easy." It was true. A short time later, I was listening to the complaints of the eternally hungry Halls. "Scheisse! They've stuck me for guard duty again. God knows what'll happen to us all. It's getting colder and colder. We won't be able to stand it." It was another clear night, and the thermometer fell to 22 degrees below freezing. I thanked my driver for saving me from another night in the open air. However, the fate that befell me instead almost made me regret my luck. We were walking toward the kitchen truck, feeling somewhat anxious about dinner, wondering if there would be enough left to fill our mess tins. When the cook saw us coming, he couldn't resist a little sarcasm. "So you're not feeling hungry tonight?" He had already taken the tureens off the fire and replaced them with the big serving dishes, which were filled with hissing water coming to a boil. "Hurry up and eat," he said, plunging his gloved hand armed with a big spoon into the depths of one of the tureens. "I have to boil this water for the surgeon. He's busy carving up the wounded." We were bolting our tepid meal, still wearing our ragged gloves, when a lieutenant arrived. "Is the water nearly ready?" "Just now, Lieutenant. It's just boiling." "Good." The lieutenant's eye fell on us. "You two, take the water to the doctor." He pointed to the lighted doorway of one of the houses. We closed our mess tins, still half full of food, and hooked them onto our belts. I grabbed one of the steaming basins, taking care not to empty its contents onto my feet, and walked toward the improvised operating room. The sole advantage of being inside this house was its temperature. It had been a long time since any of us had experienced indoor warmth. The doctor had requisitioned the large common room of a Soviet farmer and was busy with the leg of a poor fellow stretched out on the central table. Two other soldiers were holding the patient, who was jerking spasmodically and moaning with pain. Everywhere, on benches, on the floor, on the big storage chests, wounded soldiers were lying or sitting, groaning as they waited. Two orderlies were tending to them. The floor was littered with bloody bandages. Two Russian women were washing the surgical instruments in basins of hot water. The room was extremely badly lit. The doctor had put the farmer's big gas lamp beside the operating table. The farmer himself was holding another lamp over the surgeon's head. A lieutenant and a sergeant were each holding another lamp. In an angle of the room made by the big corner chimney, a young Russian was crying. He looked about 17, like me. I put my basin down beside the doctor, who plunged a thick wad of dressing into it. I stayed where I was, transfixed by the terrible sight in front of me. I couldn't lift my eyes from that naked thigh inside which the surgeon was working. The skin around the wound seemed to have been crushed, and everything was soaked with blood. New streams of blood, of a brighter, clearer red, kept running from the enormous hole in which the doctor was working with what looked like a pair of flat-bladed scissors. My head began to swim, and I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't look away. The patient was tossing his head from one side to the other. He was being held down firmly by two other soldiers. His face was completely drained of color and streaming with sweat. They had stuffed a bandage into his mouth, perhaps to keep him from crying out. It was one of the soldiers from the armored column. I couldn't move. "Hold his leg," the doctor said softly to me. I hesitated, and he looked at me again. My trembling hands took hold of the mangled leg. As they touched the skin, I could feel myself shaking. "Gently," murmured the doctor. I saw the scalpel cut even more deeply into the wound, and I could feel the muscles of the leg tensing and relaxing. Then I closed my eyes. I could hear the sounds made by the surgical instruments and the heavy, panting breath of the patient, who kept moving in agony despite the partial anesthetic. Then, although I could hardly bear to recognize it, I heard the sound of a saw. A moment later, the leg was heavier in my hand, unbelievably heavy, and I saw that it was supported 5 inches above the table only by my anguished hands. The surgeon had just detached it from the body. I remained for a moment in a ludicrous and tragic attitude, holding my hideous burden. I thought I was going to faint. Finally, I put it down on a pile of bandages beside the table. I shall never forget that leg, even if I live 100 years. My driver had managed to leave, and I waited for a moment of general inattention to do the same thing. Unfortunately, such a moment did not arrive until very late that night. I had to do a great many other things almost as troubling as the amputation. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when I finally opened the double doors of the house. As the cold struck me, it seemed more violent than ever. I hesitated, but the thought of returning to those dying men and those streams of blood turned me resolutely back into the night. The sky was clear and light, and the air seemed absolutely still. The shadows of the houses and the trucks were stamped with precise outlines on the hard, gleaming snow. I couldn't see a living soul. I walked through the village looking for my Renault. The whole convoy could have been destroyed before anyone gave the alarm. The door of an izba flew open, and a bundle of blankets with a Mauser slung across it ventured a few faltering steps onto the snow. When the man inside the blankets caught sight of me, he mumbled a few words. "You go in now. It's my turn." "Go where?" "To warm up, unless you feel like taking another round." "But I'm not on guard. I've just been helping the surgeon, and now I'm going to get some sleep." "I see. I thought you were—" He mumbled a name. "Did you say there was somewhere to get warm?" "Yes. You go on in there. They've made it headquarters for the guard. We take shifts every 15 or 20 minutes. Of course, you don't get any sleep that way, but it's better than freezing for 2 hours." "Yes, thank you. I'll go in." I pushed open the heavy door and went inside. A big fire was blazing in the fireplace. 4 soldiers, one of whom was Hals, were roasting potatoes and other vegetables under the ashes. The light from the fire was the only light in the room. Another fellow came in right after me, probably the guard I had been mistaken for. I warmed up the rest of the food in my mess tin, ate without appetite, and stretched out on the floor in front of the fireplace to sleep as best I could. Every 15 or 20 minutes, one of the guards would shake awake some poor fellow flattened by sleep. From time to time, the voice of someone protesting his fate would waken me. It was still dark when the reveille whistle shrilled in my ears. Slowly, we stood up on the floor which had served as our bed. We were rather stiff, but it had been a long time since any of us had slept without feeling cold. A young Russian woman was coming toward us from the shadows in the corner of the room. She was carrying a steaming pot which she held out to us, smiling. It was hot milk. For a moment I wondered if the milk might not be poisoned, but Hals, who preferred to die with a full stomach, had already grabbed the pot and helped himself to a generous swig. We passed the milk around among the four of us. Then Hals laughed and returned it to the Russian woman. Neither of them could understand a word the other said. Hals went up to her and kissed her on both cheeks. She blushed a deep red. We bowed and left. Immediately the cold fell on us like an icy shower. There was roll call and distribution of lukewarm ersatz coffee. As on every other morning, we needed a good half hour to warm up the engines and get them started. Well before daybreak, the 19th Company Rollbahn was jolting along the glare ice of that damned Soviet highway, the 3rd International. Several times, we had to make way for convoys driving to the rear. We stopped for lunch in a squalid hamlet where the column of tanks which preceded us had also stopped, and we learned that we were only 50 miles from Kharkov. We were all jubilant to hear that we were so close to our destination. Our convoy should arrive in 2 or 3 hours. We tried to imagine our quarters in Kharkov. "What do you think it will be like?" Lenson asked. The fellow who'd been with me for this interminable trip, the one without a kneecap, was not one to jump for joy. "I hope we won't be spending too much time there," he said. "It would be just like them to send us on to the Volga. I'd rather start back the other way than keep on going east." "If no one wants to go east, we'll never be through with the Russians," someone said. "That's true," another voice remarked. "Some people would do better to shut up instead of always talking about how afraid they are." We were back on the road about half an hour later. The sun had disappeared into a fog which veiled the horizon. The cold seemed less sharp, but damp and penetrating. We drove for about an hour. My eyes were half closed, and I had nearly fallen asleep, staring at an illuminated spot on the dashboard. My head was jolting from side to side with the motion of the truck. I decided I might as well sleep and propped myself against the door. Before closing my eyes, I looked out once more at the snowy countryside. The sky had turned gray and seemed heavier than the earth. 2 tiny black spots were coming toward us over the top of the nearest hill. Probably a couple of patrol planes. I closed my eyes. A few seconds later, my eyes flew open again. The roar of an engine passed right over our heads and was immediately followed by a series of crackling detonations. Then something unimaginable hurled me against the windshield, and I felt as if my chest and eardrums were going to explode. There was an intensity of noise which sounded like the end of the world, and we were engulfed in a shower of ice, stones, boxes, helmets, and mess tins. Our Renault nearly crashed into the car in front of us, which had come to a dead stop. Stupefied and bewildered, I opened the door and jumped down to the ground, looking back toward the source of the noise. The truck behind had almost run into us, and behind it a third truck had rolled over. Its wheels were still turning in the air. Beyond it there was nothing but flames and smoke. "Quick! Get over the bank!" Soldiers were scattering across the snow as far as I could see. "They're shooting at the trucks!" someone shouted. I dug myself into 3 feet of snow behind the bank. "Anti-aircraft defense!" yelled a sergeant who was running, doubled over, along the side of the bank. The soldiers floundering in the snow beside me aimed their guns at the sky. Good Lord, my gun was still in the Renault. I was already running back to the truck when I heard the noise of airplane engines once again. I pushed my head into the snow. A hurricane passed over me, followed by explosions both nearby and far away. That concludes the fourth part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.